January 15th, 2018. In the sterile silence of a London hotel room, Dolores O'Riordan's voice, the same voice that had given the world Linger, Zombie, and Dreams, falls silent forever. At 46, the woman who had transformed Irish melancholy into global anthems is found in a bathroom, another casualty of the demons that had stalked her since childhood. The water is still, the room is empty, and the world is about to lose one of rock music's most distinctive and haunting voices. This is Dolores O'Riordan in her final moment, the woman who had proclaimed singing is the way I release my pain, and had spent 28 years proving that statement with every note she sang. But she is also dying as someone who had carried too much pain for one voice to bear, too much trauma for one heart to heal, demonstrating that even the most beautiful art sometimes comes from the most unbearable suffering. The silence in that London hotel room is heavy with the ghosts of a million voices that had sung along to her songs. Voices of young people who had found their own pain reflected in her lyrics, their own struggles validated by her willingness to transform personal agony into universal anthems. Dolores O'Riordan had taught the world that vulnerability could be powerful, that Irish women could rock as hard as anyone, and that the most haunting melodies often came from the deepest wounds. This isn't just another story of rock and roll excess and early death. This is the biography of a woman who had discovered that her greatest gift was also her greatest burden, that the sensitivity that made her an extraordinary artist also made her extraordinarily vulnerable to the cruelties of both memory and fame. The voice that had roared zombie with righteous anger and whispered linger with heartbreaking tenderness belonged to someone who had never learned to separate her art from her pain. The woman dying in that London hotel had been more than just a rock star. She had been the voice of a generation that had grown up amid violence and uncertainty, who had given Irish culture a global platform when the world was only beginning to understand Ireland as something more than a source of conflict and sorrow. But creating that voice had required sacrificing the peace and stability that might have allowed her to live a longer, quieter life. Was this really just an accidental drowning, or was something more complex at work? In Dolores's case, the complexity wasn't conspiratorial but psychological, the inevitable result of decades spent channeling trauma into art without ever finding sustainable ways to heal the wounds that made that art possible. But to understand how a shy girl from Limerick became the voice of Irish rock and then a victim of her own sensitivity, how someone could create music that helped millions while being unable to save herself, we must first understand how it all began. September 6, 1971. Dolores Mary Eileen O'Riordan was born in Ballybricken near Limerick, Ireland, into a world where Catholic tradition, rural poverty, and the distant thunder of Northern Irish troubles created a landscape of both beauty and constraint. Her father, Terence, was a farm laborer whose drinking problems cast shadows over the household, while her mother, Eileen, worked to hold the family together through a combination of faith, determination, and the kind of stoic endurance that Irish women had perfected over generations. From her earliest memories, Dolores was different from her siblings in ways that both worried and fascinated her family. She possessed an almost supernatural sensitivity to sound, emotion, and the unspoken tensions that shaped daily life in their working-class household. Where other children seemed able to compartmentalize pain and difficulty, Dolores absorbed everything with an intensity that made ordinary experiences feel overwhelming. The Catholic Church that dominated her childhood provided both comfort and confusion for someone with Dolores's temperament. The music, the hymns, the chants, the soaring melodies that filled stone churches with ethereal beauty, spoke to something deep in her soul and provided her first understanding that sound could transform suffering into something transcendent. But the Church's teachings about sin, Guilt and the need for constant vigilance against moral failure also fed the anxiety and self-doubt that would plague her throughout her life. The countryside around Limerick where Dolores spent her childhood was both beautiful and isolating, providing the kind of natural beauty that could inspire songs while also creating the sense of being cut off from larger possibilities that characterized rural Irish life during the 1970s and 1980s. The rolling hills, ancient stone walls, and constantly changing skies that surrounded her home would later appear in her lyrics as symbols of both freedom and entrapment. The family's financial struggles meant that Dolores learned early about the gap between dreams and reality, between what you wanted from life and what life was willing to give you. The second-hand clothes, the careful budgeting, the constant awareness that money was scarce, created a background anxiety that would influence her relationship with success and security for the rest of her life. But perhaps most significantly, Dolores experienced trauma during her childhood that she would not speak about publicly until much later in her career. The sexual abuse she suffered left wounds that never fully healed, creating a relationship with trust, intimacy, and her own body that would complicate every aspect of her adult life. The silence that surrounded such experiences in 1980s Ireland meant that she had no language for understanding what had happened to her, no framework for processing the shame and confusion that followed. Could this early trauma have been what gave Dolores's voice its distinctive quality of beautiful sadness? Or was it simply one factor among many that shaped her unique artistic sensibility? The answer lay in understanding that Dolores's extraordinary talent wasn't caused by her suffering but rather existed alongside it, creating a feedback loop where her ability to transform pain into art also prevented her from ever fully escaping that pain. The same sensitivity that made her vulnerable to trauma also made her capable of creating music that could reach into other people's hearts and offer them comfort that she herself had never found. The discovery of her singing voice during her teenage years wasn't just artistic awakening. It was the discovery of a survival mechanism, a way of expressing emotions that were too complex and painful to communicate through ordinary conversation. When Dolores sang Dolores, she could access and release feelings that otherwise remained trapped inside her, creating momentary relief from the psychological pressure that had been building since childhood. The local music scene in Limerick during the late 1980s was small and limited, but it provided Dolores with her first taste of how music could create connection and community among people who felt like outsiders in their own culture. The pub sessions, amateur bands, and informal performances that characterized Irish music culture gave her opportunities to experiment with her voice and discover its distinctive qualities. But even these early performances revealed the double-edged nature of Dolores's talent. When she sang, she could captivate audiences and create moments of genuine transcendence, but the emotional investment required left her drained and vulnerable. She was learning that her gift came with costs that other performers didn't seem to pay, that channeling emotion through music was both healing and exhausting. The formation of the Cranberries in 1990 represented both the beginning of Dolores's professional career and the moment when her personal struggles became inextricably linked to public scrutiny and commercial pressure. The band, originally called the Cranberry Sauce, had been searching for a lead singer when they encountered Dolores, and the chemistry was immediate and undeniable. The demo recording of Linger that launched their career was more than just a successful audition. It was a perfect synthesis of Dolores's voice with material that showcased her ability to make personal pain feel universal. The song's delicate melody and vulnerable lyrics created a template for the kind of music that would make the Cranberries famous: beautiful, melancholy, and emotionally direct in ways that most rock music avoided. But the recording process also revealed how difficult it was for Dolores to separate her performances from her personal emotional state. Unlike many singers who could adopt different personas for different songs, Dolores seemed to access her authentic feelings every time she sang, making each recording session and live performance a form of emotional archaeology that brought buried pain to the surface. The success of Linger and the album Everybody Else Is Doing It, So Why Can't We? Transformed the Cranberries from Irish hopefuls into international stars, but it also introduced Dolores to pressures and expectations that her rural Irish background had never prepared her to handle. Suddenly, she was expected to embody the dreams and aspirations of millions of fans while maintaining the authentic vulnerability that had made her famous in the first place. The touring that followed their breakthrough was both exhilarating and overwhelming for someone with Dolores's sensitivity and history of trauma. The constant travel, the crowds of strangers, the lack of privacy, and the pressure to deliver emotional performances night after night created a lifestyle that was fundamentally incompatible with the kind of stability and security that might have helped her heal from her childhood experiences. The backstage culture of international rock touring in the 1990s was particularly challenging for someone like Dolores, who needed quiet spaces to recharge between the intense emotional performances that her music demanded. While other performers seemed to thrive on the chaos and excess that characterized life on the road, Dolores often retreated into herself, finding solace in writing and sketching rather than in the parties and social gatherings that filled the hours between shows. The fan interactions that became an inevitable part of her fame revealed both the power and the burden of her artistic impact. Young people would approach her with stories of how her music had helped them through depression, abuse, or suicidal thoughts, sharing intimate details of their struggles while looking to her for guidance and hope. While Dolores was genuinely moved by these encounters, they also placed enormous pressure on someone who was struggling with her own mental health challenges. The responsibility of being seen as a voice for the voiceless, a beacon of hope for the suffering, was both inspiring and crushing. Dolores understood that her music provided genuine comfort to people who were in pain, but she also knew that she was often unable to provide that same comfort to herself. The paradox of healing others while remaining wounded herself became a central tension in her life and career. The media attention that intensified throughout the mid-1990s often focused more on her appearance, her relationships, and her occasional erratic behavior than on her artistic achievements. The entertainment press seemed particularly fascinated by the contrast between her powerful stage presence and her fragile offstage demeanor, often portraying her as either a fierce warrior or a delicate victim rather than recognizing the complex human being who embodied both qualities. The scrutiny of her personal life became particularly intense during her relationship and marriage to Don Burton, the tour manager who had become her husband and the father of her 3 children. The relationship represented both stability and additional pressure, as Dolores tried to balance her roles as performer, wife, and mother while managing the demands of an international career and ongoing mental health struggles. The birth of her children, Taylor, Molly, and Dakota, provided Dolores with new sources of joy and purpose, but motherhood also created additional anxieties and responsibilities that were difficult to reconcile with the demands of touring and recording. The guilt of leaving her children for extended periods, combined with her own traumatic childhood experiences, created internal conflicts that were impossible to resolve satisfactorily. The domestic life that Dolores tried to create during breaks from touring revealed her deep longing for normalcy and stability. She threw herself into activities like cooking, gardening, and helping with homework, trying to create the kind of secure, loving home environment that she had never experienced as a child. But the transition between her domestic and professional identities was often jarring and difficult to manage. The financial pressures that came with supporting a family while maintaining homes in multiple countries added another layer of stress to an already complex situation. While the Cranberries were internationally successful, The financial arrangements typical of the music industry meant that Dolores often felt pressure to continue touring and recording even when her mental health would have benefited from extended breaks. The writing process that Dolores used for creating new songs became increasingly therapeutic but also increasingly painful as her personal struggles intensified. The lyrics she wrote during the late 1990s and early 2000s were more explicitly autobiographical than her earlier work, dealing directly with themes of depression, anxiety, family relationships, and the search for spiritual meaning in the face of psychological suffering. The creative collaboration with her bandmates became more challenging as Dolores's mental health issues affected her ability to maintain consistent working relationships. The other members of the Cranberries, Noel Hogan, Mike Hogan, and Fergal Lawler, were supportive and understanding. But they also had to cope with the practical difficulties of working with someone whose availability and emotional state could be unpredictable. The recording sessions for later Cranberries albums often required careful scheduling around Dolores's mental health needs, with extended breaks between vocal takes and flexible timelines that could accommodate her fluctuating energy levels and emotional state. The band developed strategies for working around her limitations while still maintaining the quality and authenticity that had made their music distinctive. The decision to take an extended hiatus from the Cranberries in the early 2000s was motivated partly by Dolores's need to focus on her mental health and family responsibilities. But it was also driven by creative differences and the recognition that continuing to work together in their established format was becoming unsustainable for everyone involved. The solo career that Dolores pursued during the 2000s represented both an artistic liberation and an additional source of pressure. The albums Are You Listening and No Baggage allowed her to explore musical directions that wouldn't have been appropriate for the Cranberries, working with different producers and musicians who brought new perspectives to her songwriting and vocal performance. The solo touring that accompanied these albums was scaled differently than her work with the Cranberries, with smaller venues and more intimate performances that were better suited to her psychological needs and artistic preferences. The acoustic performances and stripped-down arrangements allowed audiences to focus more directly on her voice and lyrics, creating connections that felt more personal and less overwhelming than the arena shows that had characterized her band's peak years. But the solo career also revealed how closely Dolores's artistic identity was tied to her work with the Cranberries. The songs she wrote during this period often dealt with themes of isolation and separation that seemed to reflect not just her personal struggles but also her distance from the collaborative relationships that had shaped her most successful work. The financial and logistical challenges of maintaining a solo career were significant, requiring Dolores to take on business responsibilities that she had previously shared with her bandmates and their management team. The pressure of making decisions about everything from set lists to merchandise while also managing her mental health and family obligations created additional stress that sometimes undermined her ability to focus on the creative work that had always been her primary source of satisfaction. The critical reception of her solo work was generally positive, with reviewers praising her continued vocal power and her willingness to explore new musical territory. But the commercial performance of the albums was modest compared to the Cranberries' success, creating financial pressures that influenced her eventual decision to reunite with the band. The return to the Cranberries for their final albums represented both a homecoming and a recognition that her most powerful artistic work emerged from collaborative relationships that allowed her to focus on what she did best, singing and songwriting, rather than managing all aspects of a career. The reunion process was carefully managed to accommodate Dolores's mental health needs and family responsibilities, with recording schedules that allowed for regular breaks and support systems that recognized the importance of maintaining her psychological stability alongside her artistic productivity. The recording of Roses in 2012 marked a successful return to the sound and chemistry that had made the Cranberries distinctive. but it also revealed how much everyone involved had learned about balancing artistic ambition with personal wellness. The album's themes of renewal and healing reflected both Dolores's personal journey and the band's collective growth as musicians and human beings. The touring that accompanied Roses was structured differently than their earlier concert schedules, with more time between shows, better support systems, and greater awareness of the warning signs that might indicate when Dolores needed additional rest or professional help. The band and their management team had developed protocols for managing the various challenges that came with Dolores's mental health conditions. The final years of Dolores's life were marked by both artistic achievement and ongoing struggle. The work on Something Else, an album of acoustic reworkings of classic Cranberries songs, provided opportunities for reflection on her career and legacy while also demonstrating that her voice remained as powerful and distinctive as ever. The stripped-down arrangements of songs like Linger and Zombie on Something Else revealed new dimensions of compositions that audiences thought they knew completely, proving that Dolores's interpretive skills had continued to develop throughout her career. The acoustic versions felt like intimate conversations with listeners who had grown up alongside her music. The European tour that accompanied Something Else was designed to be Dolores's final extended concert series, allowing her to say goodbye to audiences while performing in venues and contexts that maximized her comfort and minimized the stresses that had contributed to her earlier difficulties. The planning that went into these final performances reflected everyone's understanding that Dolores's touring days were numbered, not because of any immediate health crisis, but because the cumulative effects of decades of performing while managing mental health challenges had made the lifestyle increasingly unsustainable. The recording sessions for what would become In the End were structured as a gradual, low-pressure process that allowed Dolores to contribute vocals at her own pace while giving the other band members time to develop musical arrangements that would showcase her voice in the most supportive possible context. The lyrics that Dolores wrote for these final songs were both hopeful and melancholy, dealing with themes of mortality, legacy, and the search for peace that had become increasingly important to her. The song suggested someone who was trying to make sense of her life's journey while also preparing for whatever might come next. The vocal performances on these final recordings captured Dolores at both her most technically accomplished and her most emotionally vulnerable. Her voice had acquired new depths and textures through years of experience and struggle, allowing her to convey complex emotions with an efficiency and power that younger singers rarely achieved. The collaborative process with her bandmates during these final sessions was characterized by mutual respect, creative generosity, and the shared understanding that they were creating something that might serve as a lasting monument to their decades of working together. Everyone involved approached the project with both professional dedication and personal affection. The last song that Dolores recorded, In the End, became both a summary of her artistic philosophy and an unintentional farewell. The lyrics, "It's not the end, it's never the end," proved prophetic in ways that no one could have anticipated, suggesting both her awareness of mortality and her faith in the enduring power of music to transcend individual lives. The second album, No Need to Argue, represented both the creative peak of the Cranberries and the moment when Dolores's personal struggles became impossible to ignore. The song Zombie, which became their biggest hit and most enduring anthem, was written in response to the IRA bombing in Warrington that killed 2 children. But it also served as a perfect vehicle for Dolores's ability to transform rage and sorrow into something beautiful and powerful. The recording of Zombie captured something that had never been heard before in popular music. A young Irish woman's voice raised in fury against the violence that had plagued her homeland for decades. The song's distinctive vocal style, with its alternating whispers and roars, its Celtic influences and modern rock production, created a sound that was both ancient and contemporary, both Irish and universal. But the song's success also created expectations that would prove impossible to sustain. Suddenly, Dolores was expected to be not just a singer but a spokesperson for Irish culture, a voice for peace in Northern Ireland, and a representative of everything that was authentic and meaningful about her homeland. The weight of these expectations was enormous for someone who had never asked to be a symbol of anything beyond her own experience. The live performances of Zombie became legendary for their intensity and emotional power. But they also took an enormous toll on Dolores. Each performance required her to access and express the deepest levels of her anger and pain, creating a feedback loop where her most powerful artistic moments were also her most psychologically depleting ones. Behind all that raw vocal power and stage presence, was there a fragility that nobody could see? The answer was visible to anyone who looked carefully at the interviews and behind-the-scenes footage from this period. Away from the stage, Dolores was often quiet, withdrawn, and visibly struggling with the pressures of fame and the expectations that came with it. The contrast between her powerful public persona and her vulnerable private self was striking and suggested someone who was using performance as both expression and escape. The personal relationships that Dolores attempted to maintain during this period were complicated by the demands of her career and the psychological effects of her childhood trauma. The marriage to Don Burton, her tour manager and former member of Duran Duran's crew, represented an attempt to create stability and normalcy. But it was also a relationship that developed within the context of her professional life rather than separate from it. The birth of her children provided Dolores with new sources of joy and purpose. But motherhood also created additional pressures and responsibilities that were difficult to balance with the demands of an international music career. The touring schedule that kept her away from home for months at a time was particularly difficult for someone who valued family connection and stability as much as artistic achievement. The mental health struggles that began to seriously affect Dolores during the mid-1990s weren't just the result of fame and pressure. They were the delayed consequences of childhood trauma that had never been properly addressed or treated. The depression, anxiety, and episodes of what would later be diagnosed as bipolar disorder were symptoms of psychological wounds that had been hidden rather than healed. The treatment options available to Dolores during this period were limited by both the stigma surrounding mental health issues in Ireland and the entertainment industry's tendency to prioritize career demands over personal wellness. The medications, therapy, and support systems that might have helped her manage her conditions were often interrupted by touring schedules and recording commitments that couldn't be postponed or canceled without significant financial and professional consequences. The alcohol use that became increasingly problematic during Dolores's later years wasn't just recreational drinking. It was a form of self-medication for psychological pain that she didn't know how else to manage. The temporary relief that alcohol provided from anxiety, depression, and traumatic memories created a pattern of dependence that became increasingly difficult to break as the pressures of her career intensified. The periods of erratic behavior that occasionally made headlines weren't just celebrity meltdowns. They were symptoms of serious mental health crises that required professional intervention and long-term treatment. The incidents at airports, the canceled concerts, and the public struggles with substance abuse were visible manifestations of invisible suffering that had been building for years. The solo career that Dolores pursued during the 2000s represented both an attempt to reclaim artistic control and a recognition that the Cranberries had become associated with expectations and pressures that were no longer sustainable. The albums Are You Listening? And No Baggage allowed her to explore different musical directions while working at a pace that was more compatible with her mental health needs. But the solo work also revealed how difficult it was for Dolores to separate her identity as an artist from her role as the voice of the Cranberries. The songs she wrote during this period often dealt with themes of isolation, struggle, and the search for authentic connection that had characterized her work with the band, suggesting that changing context hadn't necessarily changed the underlying issues that fueled her creativity. The reunion with the Cranberries for their final albums represented both a return to familiar creative territory and an acknowledgement that her most powerful artistic work had emerged from collaborative relationships that allowed her to focus on singing and songwriting, rather than managing all aspects of a solo career. The recording sessions for Roses and the posthumously released In the End captured Dolores at both her most vocally powerful and her most personally vulnerable. The songs dealt explicitly with themes of mortality, legacy, and the search for peace that had become increasingly important to her as she struggled with ongoing mental health challenges. The final recordings that Dolores made before her death included vocals for songs that wouldn't be completed until after she was gone, creating a haunting situation where her voice continued to offer comfort and connection to fans even after she was no longer alive to sing for them. The lyrics, "It's not the end, it's never the end," became both her final artistic statement and an unintentional prophecy about the enduring power of her musical legacy. The circumstances surrounding her death in London were both tragic and sadly predictable for someone who had struggled with mental health and substance abuse issues for years. The combination of alcohol and prescription medications that led to her accidental drowning represented the culmination of decades of using chemical substances to manage psychological pain that had never been adequately treated. The investigation that followed confirmed that her death was accidental rather than intentional, but it also revealed the extent of her ongoing struggles with bipolar disorder and alcohol dependence. The toxicology reports and witness statements painted a picture of someone who was trying to maintain her professional commitments, while battling conditions that made daily functioning increasingly difficult. The immediate response to Dolores's death revealed the profound impact she had made on popular music and Irish culture during her 28-year career. Radio stations around the world played tributes to her work. Fans gathered at impromptu memorials to share memories and sing her songs, and fellow musicians spoke about losing not just a colleague, but a unique voice that could never be replaced. The funeral in Limerick was unlike anything Ireland had seen before. Thousands gathered, fans, family, fellow musicians, and ordinary people whose lives had been touched by her voice. The procession moved slowly through streets wet with winter rain, droplets falling like tears from gray Irish skies, each one carrying the weight of collective grief. Then something extraordinary happened. As the cortege passed through the city center, a voice rose from the crowd, tentative at first, then growing stronger. "To all the girls I've loved before." "No, that wasn't right," someone corrected. "All my life is changing every day." And then it happened. Thousands of voices joined together, singing Dreams in unison, the song rising from the wet streets like incense, transforming individual grief into collective celebration. The sound was overwhelming, not the polished harmony of a choir, but the raw, imperfect beauty of human voices united in love and loss. Children who had grown up with her music sang beside grandparents who had discovered her through their grandchildren. The melody that had been born from one woman's wounded heart now became the heartbeat of an entire community. As the procession continued, the songs changed. Linger, then Dreams again, then whispered fragments of Zombie. But the voices never stopped. What had begun as a funeral became something unprecedented, a living concert where Dolores's audience sang her songs back to her one final time, their voices carrying across the rain-soaked streets of Limerick like a prayer, like a promise, like proof that some silences can never last. Standing in that crowd, listening to thousands sing her words, it became clear that Dolores had achieved something remarkable. Her voice was her wound, and her wound was her voice. But from that wound had flowed music that transcended the pain that created it. She had given millions permission to feel deeply, to hurt honestly, to transform their own wounds into something beautiful. "Singing is the way I release my pain," she had said. But in those Limerick streets, surrounded by voices lifted in tribute, her pain had become everyone's healing. Her wounds had become everyone's strength. Her silence had become everyone's song. The service was both a celebration of her artistic achievements and an acknowledgement of the mental health struggles that had ultimately claimed her life. For the first time in Irish history, a major public funeral became an opportunity to discuss depression, bipolar disorder, and the importance of seeking help. Her death was accidental, not intentional, but it reflected a lifetime of battles that shouldn't have been fought alone. The water that had stilled around her in London had been matched by the rain that fell on Limerick. But while one represented ending, the other represented renewal, the eternal cycle of grief and healing, silence and song, wound and voice that her music had always embodied. Her voice was her wound, and her wound was her voice. But in death, that wound had finally stopped bleeding, leaving only the voice, eternal, transcendent, forever echoing in the hearts of those who understood that the most beautiful songs often come from the deepest pain. Do we honor the art, or mourn the wound that created it? In Dolores O'Riordan's case, perhaps the answer is both. We cherish the beauty she created while working to ensure that future artists receive the support that might allow them to find healing alongside their art, that no one else has to choose between creating beauty and finding peace.